Today I want to take a look at Psalm 46, specifically verse 1 will be our launching pad. We'll talk about the whole psalm, but verse 1 is really where I want to focus on. But first, a little story. I was probably 10 or 12 years old. I was born and raised in Ottawa, and along the Rideau Canal that cuts right through the city, the Rideau Canal, and somewhere along there, I think a little north of the Bank Street Bridge, there's this tiny little island, I call it. It's not really very far from the edge, maybe 12 feet from the edge of the sidewalk into the water, and it's not very long. In fact, if you were driving along, you'd probably miss it. But there's this little island there, and quite often I would hop on my bike or I'd go for a walk, and I'd walk down to this island and I would swim in the canal and swim to this little island. It's in the middle of everything. It's not really a refuge. It's in the middle of everything, not in the middle of nowhere. But it was certainly just a place where I liked to go and hang out and people watch. And I would just kind of sit on the island for about half an hour or so, and then swim back and walk home. One day I was walking to this island, and in Ottawa, as it is today, it was back then. This would be 1970 or so. It was back then that the walkway was shared with bicycles. It was also a bike path. So I'm walking along there, and I'm about halfway, I guess, from between my home and this island, and I was struck by a bicycle, and the impact just kind of threw me right to the ground, backwards, and I landed pretty much on my head. I banged the back of my head pretty badly. In fact, I literally saw stars. My body kind of tightened. I was like, in retrospect, I think I may have been convulsing. I'm not sure, but I was hurt pretty bad. And the guy who struck me stopped his bike and was walking back toward me, and I was still laying on the ground, stunned, and I could hear the approach of his girlfriend or his wife from the other side, and she's off her cycle now, and she's yelling at him, and they're having an argument about why this guy hit me. And I'm sitting there, and there's just so much anger in the atmosphere, there's so much hurt in my body, that the only thing that I can think of at that particular time is I wanted to go home. I wanted to go where I could find peace and comfort and care. I wanted to go home. The psalmist talks about a place to go to find refuge in Psalm 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. That word present means proven. It means that God has already proved himself faithful. God will prove himself faithful in the future, and God can prove himself faithful now if we only seek refuge in him. And then the psalmist goes on and explains that we can seek refuge anytime. We can seek refuge even in the middle of natural disaster. Right? Verse number 2, let's go on. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. He's talking about all of these extremes, all of these problems that occur in nature and natural disaster, the storms, the pestilences, disease, those things that we have no control over. Even though all of these things happen, even though mountains and earthquakes and mountains tumble into the sea, and the sea is roaring. Did you catch that? It's roaring and it's foaming. These are very tumultuous, a very tumultuous description of a very tumultuous scene, where waters are roaring and it's storming and there's earthquakes and there's pestilence and all of this stuff is occurring. And then look at verse 4. Let's check out verse 4, because there's a comparison here between the rough waters, and then in verse 4 he says, but check this out, he says, there is a river. Not a tumultuous sea, not roaring and foaming, but a peaceful, gentle river whose streams make glad the city of God, that there is a river whose streams flow into the presence of God, whose streams make glad those who live in the presence of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. And then the psalmist says that in the midst of this river is God. The river shall not be moved. The river shall not dry up. The river is eternal, and God will help the river when morning dawns. God will help this peaceful river when the storm is over. So that's the natural sense. And then the psalmist says that we can also trust God even when trouble caused by humans it exists. The political strife specifically is what he's talking about in verse 6. He says, the nations rage and the kingdoms totter. Did you see that? They're like the water rages and foams, the nations all rage. As the mountains topple into the sea, kingdoms will topple. Kingdoms, nations will come and go. But God utters his voice and the earth melts. God is in control. And the Lord of hosts is with us, he says, verse 7. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now that word fortress is interesting. It's a military term, and it means fortified. A fortress is fortified. That is, it cannot be penetrated. It cannot tumble. It cannot be knocked down. And so as God is our strength and our refuge in our difficult times, when we just flow into him, we just flow into his presence and take refuge in his promise and take refuge in Jesus Christ, then we will find peace, comfort, and care, and protection. So all of this he talks about, and he says, in nature there's going to be problems, but there's a river. In politics and in there's going to be man-made problems, right? But there's the voice of God, and then it all culminates in this one phrase in verse 10, which I think you're going to recognize because it's quoted often. Verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." In the middle of all that is going on in this world right now, I mean, we were just getting a handle on the coronavirus, and then political catastrophe breaks out with our neighbors to the south in the United States. There's political upheaval. There's disease. This is the reality of the world in which we live at the moment. But God calls us to be still and know that he is God. Know that he utters his voice and the earth melts. To know that he will be exalted, still in verse 10, among those nations. Exalted is lifted up. That he is above all those nations. He is above the political turmoil. He will be exalted in all the earth. He is above natural disaster. He is above this disease. He is above earthquakes and storms. Verse 11, the Lord of hosts is with us, he repeats. The God of Jacob is our fortress. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So yet, even in the middle of our despair, even now, there is a river, there is a refuge, there is a fortress to which we can go and be spiritually nourished and spiritually protected, spiritually enriched and spiritually strengthened. And that is Jesus Christ. That is God, the presence of God. And we don't have to lay on a sidewalk convulsing and being afraid of what's going on around us. We can pick ourselves up and go to our refuge where we will find peace and protection and calm. So folks, Next Wednesday, that's June 10th at 7 o'clock, June 10th, 2020, Good Shepherd Church will hold a video conference prayer session. And all of our members are invited to attend. And the sole focus of that is simply to be still and to seek God in the midst of all that's going on around us. But to seek God, to lift our gaze to the Lord, lift our gaze to Jesus, to seek his forgiveness and his protection and his grace and his mercy. And it will be, unlike the island in the Rideau Canal, it will be a place of peace and calm in the presence of the Lord. A place of peace and calm in the middle of a pandemic and political strife worldwide. So let me close with this prayer. Just close your eyes if you like, and let me pray this for us. God, in this time of violence and terror and political upheaval, we cling to you for courage and hope. We look to you for strength and help, wisdom and healing. Increase the spirit of neighborliness among us, that in peril we may uphold one another, in suffering tend to one another, and in loneliness and exile befriend one another. Grant us brave and enduring hearts, that we may strengthen one another until the disciplines and testings of these days are ended, and you again give peace in our time. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.